Montana Territory, 1872. The frontier stretched before Wade Blackburn like an untamed promise, harsh and unforgiving as the winter that had just released its grip on the land. Spring brought green to the valley, but Wade's heart remained as barren as the Badlands in drought. At 25, he had seen enough of the West to know that a man survived by keeping to himself and trusting no one but his horse and his rifle. The morning sun cast long shadows across his modest ranch as Wade leaned against the porch railing, coffee steaming in the cool air. The Gallatin Valley spread before him, mountains still capped with snow in the distance. 2 years of backbreaking work had transformed this plot from wilderness to something resembling a home, but the cabin behind him echoed with emptiness. A man builds something to leave behind, his father had told him before consumption took him 3 winters past. Something more than just timber and cattle. Wade grimaced and drained his cup. Family was a weakness a frontier man couldn't afford. He had watched too many widows clutching children at fresh graves, seen too many men broken by loss. The West took more than it gave, and he had decided long ago that he would keep what little he had safe by keeping his heart locked away. His ranch hand, old Elijah, limped across the yard toward him, waving a letter. Mail came through, something from back east, the grizzled man said, handing over the envelope. Wade turned it over in his hands, recognizing his cousin's neat handwriting. James had been writing for months, insisting Wade needed a wife, even sending advertisements from matchmaking services. Wade had ignored them all. Another lecture on my bachelor ways, no doubt, he muttered, but tore it open anyway. The letter was brief, but its contents sent a cold shock through him. She arrives next week, Elijah read over his shoulder. Who arrives? Wade's jaw clenched, apparently my bride. James had taken matters into his own hands. Without Wade's permission, his well-meaning cousin had corresponded with a mail-order bride service and paid the woman's way west. According to the letter, one Grace Thompson from Boston would arrive on Tuesday's stage, expecting to marry the rancher who had sent for her, except Wade had sent for no one. I cannot be responsible for some city woman who doesn't know the first thing about ranch life, Wade protested, crumpling the letter. The frontier is no place for Eastern delicacy. She will be miserable and I will be trapped. Elijah's weathered face creased with amusement. Might do you good to have a woman around, put some life in these walls. Life, Wade gestured to the vast emptiness surrounding them. This land takes life, Elijah, it doesn't nurture it. But there was nothing to be done. The woman was already on her way, traveling 1,500 miles to marry a man who hadn't asked for her. The least Wade could do was meet her at the stagecoach, explain the mistake, and arrange for her return journey. The town of Willow Creek had grown from a trading post to a respectable settlement over the past decade. The main street boasted a hotel, general store, 2 saloons, and even a small church. Wade rode in on Tuesday morning with a storm brewing both in the sky and in his mood. The stagecoach was late, delayed by spring mud that turned the roads to treacherous ribbons. Wade paced outside the station, rehearsing the speech he would give. He would be kind but firm. This was no life for an Eastern woman. She would thank him eventually for sending her back before the frontier crushed her spirit. When the coach finally arrived, mud-splattered and weary, Wade straightened his collar and set his jaw. Passengers began to disembark, a traveling salesman, an older couple, a young man in a suit too fine for the territory. Wade scanned for a woman traveling alone, picturing someone prim and proper with gloves and a parasol. No such woman appeared. As the last passenger stepped down, Wade frowned. A slender young woman in a practical traveling dress helped the driver unload a trunk. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple style, escaping in tendrils around her face. She wore no frills or fancy ornaments, just a clean dress the color of prairie sage. When she turned, her eyes found his, deep brown and direct, with no hint of fragility or fear. "Mr. Blackburn?" she asked, approaching with a confidence that surprised him. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, tipping his hat automatically. "Are you Miss Thompson?" "I am," she replied, extending her hand in a forthright manner more common to businessmen than ladies. "Grace Thompson, 22 years old, from Massachusetts, not Boston as your cousin may have written. I believe we have an arrangement to discuss." Wade found himself momentarily speechless. This was not the delicate flower he had expected. She stood straight-backed before him, taking in the town with observant eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Up close, he could see she was beautiful, but in an unexpected way. Her features were strong rather than dainty, her complexion warmed by sun rather than sheltered from it. "About that arrangement," he began stiffly, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. My cousin acted without my knowledge or consent. I never sent for a bride." He expected tears, outrage, perhaps a swoon. Instead, Grace Thompson's expression shifted to one of calm assessment. "I see," she said after a moment. "That explains the lack of correspondence from you directly." Thunder rumbled in the distance as the first fat raindrops began to fall. "We should get inside," Wade said, gesturing toward the hotel. "We can discuss arrangements for your return journey." "Return journey." She raised an eyebrow, retrieving her trunk handle before he could offer to carry it. "Mr. Blackburn, I have spent my entire savings to come west. I have sold everything I owned." "There is nothing to return to." The rain began to fall in earnest as they hurried toward the hotel porch. Once under cover, Wade ran a hand through his damp hair, frustration mounting. "Miss Thompson, I cannot marry you." "I did not ask for a wife." "No," she agreed, setting down her trunk and looking him directly in the eye. "But you do need help with your ranch. Your cousin wrote extensively about your difficulties managing alone with just one aging hand." Wade's frown deepened. "James had no right." "Mr. Blackburn," she interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind, "I did not come west solely to be a wife. I came to build a new life. I am capable of cooking, sewing, gardening, keeping accounts, and I learn quickly. If you won't have me as a bride, perhaps you would consider me as a housekeeper until I can establish myself elsewhere." A flash of lightning illuminated her determined face, and in that moment, Wade saw something he recognized, the same stubborn resolve that had kept him going through blizzards and drought, through loneliness and loss. This woman had the look of someone who would not break easily. "The ranch is 15 miles out," he said finally. "It's isolated, rough, the work never ends. I didn't come west expecting parlor games and dinner parties, Mr. Blackburn." The rain pounded on the hotel roof as they stared at each other, two strangers brought together by a meddling cousin and circumstances neither had chosen. "1 month," he said finally. "You can stay 1 month as housekeeper. If it doesn't work out, I'll pay your way to wherever you want to go next." Her smile transformed her face, bringing a warmth to her eyes that caught him off guard. "That's all I ask, for a chance to prove my worth." Wade didn't know then how those words would echo through the months to come. He couldn't have imagined how one woman's presence would change not just his home, but the very foundations of what he believed about life on the frontier. All he knew was that the lonely cabin waiting for him would, for the first time, have someone other than himself inside its walls when night fell, and that thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The journey to the ranch was silent save for the creak of the wagon and the steady drumming of rain. Grace sat beside Wade on the seat, sheltered somewhat by the broad brim of his hat, which he had insisted she wear. She asked no questions, made no complaints about the muddy road or the dampness that seeped through their clothes. When the rain finally stopped and the clouds parted to reveal the valley below, Wade glanced over to gauge her reaction. Many who came west wrote home about the majesty of the mountains and the vastness of the sky, but few were prepared for the isolation, the absolute removal from civilization that ranch life entailed. "There it is," he said, nodding toward the cluster of buildings nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills. "Blackburn Ranch." Grace leaned forward slightly, taking in the modest cabin, the barn, the corrals, and the scattered cattle grazing on the spring grass. Her expression revealed nothing. "It's a good piece of land," she said finally. "South-facing slope for a garden, creek nearby, you've chosen well." Wade blinked in surprise. Most people remarked on the loneliness first, the distance from neighbors and town, not the practical aspects of the property. "The garden hasn't been planted yet this year," he admitted. "Elijah and I focus on the cattle mostly." "I'll start one tomorrow," she said with quiet certainty. "A ranch needs fresh vegetables, and what we don't eat we can preserve for winter." Wade found himself suddenly, irrationally annoyed by her confidence. She spoke as if her place here was already established, as if the temporary arrangement they had agreed upon was merely a formality. "Miss Thompson, I want to be clear. This is a 1-month arrangement. Don't go making long-term plans." She turned those direct brown eyes to him again, unruffled by his tone. "Mr. Blackburn, I always plan for the future, even when the present is uncertain." It's how I've survived this long. Something in her voice hinted at a story deeper than the few facts he knew about her. Before he could inquire further, they arrived at the ranch, where Elijah waited on the porch. The old ranch hand made no effort to hide his surprise or his delight at seeing a woman step down from the wagon. He removed his hat and offered a small bow that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Miss Thompson, this is Elijah Monroe," Wade said. "He's been with the ranch since I started it." "Since before that," the old man corrected, shaking Grace's hand. "Knew this land when buffalo still roamed it freely." "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Thompson." "Please call me Grace," she replied warmly, "and I hope you'll share some of that history with me. I've always believed that understanding the past of a place helps in building its future." Elijah beamed, clearly won over already, and Wade felt a twinge of annoyance. The woman had been on his property for less than 5 minutes and already seemed to be weaving herself into its fabric. "I'll show you where you'll be staying," Wade said curtly, lifting her trunk from the wagon. The cabin was simple, 2 bedrooms, a main room that served as both kitchen and living space, and a small lean-to that housed additional supplies. Wade had built it himself, adding on as time and materials allowed. It was functional but sparse, with few touches that might make it a home. "You can have the second bedroom," he said, pushing open the door to a small room containing little more than a bed frame and chest of drawers. "I haven't had need of it." Grace stepped inside, setting down the smaller bag she'd carried. "It's perfect," she said, though there was nothing perfect about the dusty room with its bare walls and uncurtained window. "The pump is outside." "Outhouse is behind the cabin. We rise at dawn, work till dusk," Wade continued, reciting the facts of ranch life as if reading from a manual. "Meals are simple. There's no time for fancy cooking." "I understand," she said simply. Wade shifted uncomfortably, uncertain what more to say. He had expected questions, complaints, perhaps tears when she saw the primitive conditions. Her calm acceptance unnerved him. "I'll let you get settled then," he said finally, backing toward the door. "Supper is at sundown." Grace nodded, already unpacking her trunk with efficient movements. As Wade closed the door, he caught a glimpse of her placing a small framed photograph on the chest of drawers, the only personal item he had seen her bring. He wondered briefly who might be in that photograph, but quickly pushed the thought aside. The less he knew about Grace Thompson, the easier it would be when she left, because she would leave. 1 month and the ranch would return to its quiet rhythms, undisturbed by a woman's presence. That was what he wanted, what he had always wanted, wasn't it? By the end of the first week, Wade was forced to admit that Grace Thompson was unlike any woman he had ever encountered. She rose before dawn without complaint, had breakfast waiting when he and Elijah came in from the early chores, and spent her days in constant motion. The garden plot, neglected for 2 seasons, had been cleared, turned, and planted with seeds she had brought with her. The cabin's interior had been transformed, floors scrubbed to reveal grain patterns Wade had forgotten existed, windows washed until they gleamed, shelves organized with a logic that somehow made the small space seem larger. Even more surprising was her willingness to learn about ranch work. When her household duties were complete, she would seek out Wade or Elijah, asking questions about the cattle, the horses, the seasonal rhythms of ranch life. "A woman doesn't need to concern herself with branding and calving," Wade had said dismissively when she asked to observe. "Mr. Blackburn," she had replied, her voice level but with an undercurrent of steel, "a person who lives on a ranch should understand all aspects of its operation." "I have no intention of being decorative or useless." After that, he had reluctantly allowed her to accompany him on his rounds, surprised to find she could ride competently, if not expertly. She watched everything with those observant eyes, asking questions that revealed a sharp intelligence and practical mind. By the end of the second week, Wade found the rhythm of his days had subtly shifted to accommodate her presence. He caught himself watching the clock in the late afternoon, aware that supper would be waiting. He began to bring in wildflowers or interesting stones he found while riding the range, leaving them on the porch without comment. Grace would arrange the flowers in a jar on the table or add the stones to a growing collection on the windowsill, never remarking on where they had come from. It was a silent exchange, an acknowledgement without words. Yet Wade maintained his distance. Each night, after the dishes were cleared and the day's work discussed, he would retreat to the porch or his bedroom, avoiding the moments when conversation might turn personal. He did not ask about her life before Montana, though curiosity gnawed at him. He did not speak of his own past or dreams. The wall between them was of his own making, and he reinforced it daily with the reminder. 1 month and she would be gone. The first hint that the arrangement might be more complicated than he anticipated came on a Sunday morning in the 3rd week of Grace's stay. Wade had risen early as usual, but instead of finding Grace in the kitchen, he discovered a note on the table. Gone to church in town, borrowed Daisy, back by afternoon, stew in the warming oven. JT. Daisy was the gentle mare Wade kept for occasional visitors, and the thought of Grace riding 15 miles alone both concerned and impressed him. But it was the simple fact of her absence that affected him most strangely. The cabin, which had seemed perfectly adequate when he lived alone, now felt emptier than before. Missing the lady already? Elijah asked with a knowing smile when Wade emerged onto the porch, coffee cup in hand. Just surprised she went all that way for a sermon, Wade deflected. Church ain't just about sermons, the old man observed, whittling at a piece of pine with his pocket knife. It's community. Something folks need out here even more than back east. Wade grunted noncommittally and turned his attention to the distant hills. She's a fine woman, Elijah continued, undeterred. Smart, hardworking. Pretty too, though she doesn't make much of it. She's leaving in another week, Wade reminded him. Is she? The old man's knife paused. Seems to me she's putting down roots. That garden ain't something you plant if you're planning to leave. Wade had noticed the same thing but had avoided examining it too closely. The garden was expansive, with far more vegetables than 2 men could consume. The preserving jars she had ordered from the general store spoke of harvest and winter preparations. We had an agreement, he said firmly, 1 month. Agreements can change, Elijah observed mildly. When circumstances change. What circumstances have changed? The old man gave him a long look. Maybe the fact that you've smiled more in these 3 weeks than in the 2 years before. Wade turned away, uncomfortable with the observation and unwilling to acknowledge its truth. I'm riding the north pasture, he said shortly, and left without another word. But as he rode through the green spring grass, checking on new calves and the condition of the herd, Wade found his thoughts returning to the cabin and the woman who had, in such a short time, transformed it from a place of mere shelter to something that felt remarkably like a home. The problem wasn't that Grace Thompson failed to fit into ranch life. The problem was that she fit too well, and Wade's carefully constructed solitude was crumbling around him. Grace returned in the late afternoon, her cheeks flushed from the ride and her hair loosened by the wind. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. The service was lovely, she announced as she entered the cabin, where Wade sat at the table mending a bridle. Reverend Parker asked after you, said he hasn't seen you since Christmas. Wade didn't look up from his work. Church is a long ride for words I can read in the Bible myself. It's not just about the words, she said, echoing Elijah's earlier sentiment. It's about sharing them with others. She placed the package on the table beside him. I brought you something. Despite himself, Wade set aside the bridle and untied the string around the package. Inside was a book of poetry, well-worn but carefully kept. Tennyson, he read from the cover, then looked up with a raised eyebrow. I didn't take you for the romantic type, Miss Thompson. There's a great deal you don't know about me, Mr. Blackburn, she replied, removing her riding gloves. And poetry isn't merely romantic. It helps us make sense of life, even life on the frontier. Wade opened the book carefully, noting pencil marks in the margins and dried flowers pressed between certain pages. This is yours, he realized, a personal copy. Yes, she said simply, I can't accept this. You can borrow it then, she countered. Read Ulysses first, page 43. I think you might find it speaks to you. Before he could protest further, she moved to the stove, lighting it to prepare the evening meal. Wade found himself holding the book with a strange sense of intimacy, as if she had handed him a piece of herself rather than merely a collection of poems. That night, after Grace had retired to her room, Wade sat by the light of a lamp and turned to page 43. The poem spoke of a restless king, home from his adventures but yearning still for more horizon, more experience, more life. One line in particular caught his attention. I am a part of all that I have met. In the margin beside it, in neat handwriting he now recognized as Grace's, was a single word. True. Wade closed the book slowly, disturbed by the echo of his own unspoken thoughts in both the poem and Grace's annotation. He had come west seeking something, freedom, perhaps, or purpose, and had found a measure of both in the ranch. But in building walls against loss and pain, had he also walled himself off from the experiences that made life worth living? He glanced toward Grace's closed door, wondering what experiences had shaped her, what losses had driven her west, what she sought in this harsh but beautiful land. For the first time, he allowed himself to admit he wanted to know her story, all of it. The thought was still unsettling when he finally extinguished the lamp and went to bed, the book of poetry on the table beside him, like a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. The opportunity to learn more about Grace came unexpectedly the next day. A spring storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing heavy rain that made outdoor work impossible by mid-morning. Wade and Elijah returned to the cabin, soaked and chilled, to find Grace kneading dough at the table. "Perfect day for fresh bread," she observed as they hung their dripping coats by the door. "And for mending those shirts you've been neglecting, Mr. Blackburn." There was a teasing quality to her voice that Wade might have bristled at weeks earlier. Now, he found himself responding with a half-smile. "Thought that might be why you came west, Miss Thompson. To remind me about my mending." She laughed, a sound that still surprised him with its warmth. "I came west for the same reason most do, to build something of my own." The rain drummed on the roof as Elijah excused himself to his small cabin behind the main house, leaving Wade and Grace alone. For once, Wade didn't immediately seek an excuse to retreat. "What did you hope to build?" he asked, sitting at the table and watching her work the dough with strong, capable hands. Grace's movements slowed momentarily, then resumed their rhythm. "A life where I answer to no one but myself," she said, "where my work and my choices are my own." "Difficult for a woman alone," Wade observed. "More difficult for a woman who isn't alone," she countered, "at least in the East." She formed the dough into a loaf and placed it in a pan to rise, then wiped her hands on her apron and sat across from him. "My father died when I was 16, she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "My mother remarried quickly, necessity, not love. My stepfather was," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "He was a successful man, but not a kind one. He had very specific ideas about a woman's place." Wade could fill in the gaps easily enough. The Western newspapers occasionally carried stories of women fleeing abusive homes, though such matters were usually discussed in euphemisms rather than direct terms. "When my mother passed last year, there was nothing to keep me there," Grace continued. "I had some money saved from sewing work, not enough to live independently in Boston, but perhaps enough to start fresh elsewhere." "So you answered a mail-order bride advertisement," Wade said, still confused by this choice. "Why tie yourself to another man you didn't know?" Grace met his eyes steadily. "Because a contract is clear, terms stated, obligations understood, and your cousin's letters painted a picture of a decent man who needed a partner, not a possession." Wade shifted uncomfortably, both flattered and discomfited by his cousin's apparent description of him. "James has always had an optimistic view of my character," he said dryly. "He wasn't wrong," Grace replied with unexpected directness. "You are a decent man, Wade Blackburn. You've kept your word about giving me a chance here, even though you never wanted me to come in the first place." It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice created a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "My week is almost up," she continued, her eyes dropping to her hands folded on the table. "I should know your intentions." The question hung between them in the quiet cabin, punctuated only by the steady rainfall outside. Wade found himself at a crossroads he had been avoiding since Grace's arrival. "I don't know my intentions," he admitted finally. "I built this place to be alone, thought that was what I wanted, needed. Now I'm not so sure." Grace nodded slowly. "Then perhaps we both need more time to be sure." "Stay through the summer," Wade found himself saying, "as housekeeper if that's what you want, or," he hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. "Or," she prompted gently, "or we could revisit the original arrangement, not right away," he added quickly, "but perhaps in time if we suited each other." The smile that bloomed on Grace's face made something shift inside him, a loosening of a constraint he hadn't fully recognized until that moment. "I would like to stay through the summer," she said. "As for the rest, I believe we have time to discover what might be possible." Wade nodded, oddly relieved and terrified at once. He had just opened a door he had kept firmly closed since arriving in Montana, the possibility of sharing his life, his ranch, his future with someone else. I should check on the horses, he said, rising abruptly, needing space to process this unexpected turn. In this downpour, Grace raised an eyebrow. They don't mind the rain, he said, reaching for his still damp coat. Neither do I. But as he stepped onto the porch, he paused, looking back at the woman who had, in less than a month, upended everything he thought he knew about himself and what he wanted from life on the frontier. Thank you, he said quietly, for the book and for your story. Grace's smile followed him into the rain, warming him even as the cold drops soaked through his coat once more. Summer unfurled across the valley in waves of green and gold. The days lengthened, the cattle grew fat on rich grass, and the garden thrived under Grace's careful tending. May turned to June, June to July, and the temporary arrangement stretched on without further discussion of timelines or departures. The ranch itself seemed to flourish with Grace's presence. The vegetable garden expanded. A small flock of chickens took up residence in a coop Wade built behind the cabin, and wildflower seeds scattered along the pathway bloomed in cheerful profusion. Inside, the cabin transformed further. Curtains appeared at windows, handmade quilts brightened beds, and bookshelves Wade constructed one rainy afternoon soon filled with volumes ordered from catalogs or purchased on monthly trips to town. More significant than these physical changes were the shifts in Wade himself. The silence that had once dominated his evenings gave way to conversation, to shared readings from Grace's growing library, to the exchange of stories and ideas. He found himself laughing more, frowning less, looking forward rather than dwelling in memories of what had been lost. "You're whistling," Elijah observed one morning as they mended a section of fence. "Never heard you do that before she came." Wade drove a post into the ground with more force than necessary. "Don't read too much into it, old man." "Don't need to read anything," Elijah replied with a knowing smile. "It's written plain as day for anyone with eyes." The truth was, Wade found himself increasingly drawn to Grace in ways that went beyond appreciation for her work or enjoyment of her company. He noticed details, the way sunlight caught in her chestnut hair, the small scar at the corner of her right eyebrow, how she hummed softly when working at tasks that required concentration. They had settled into a partnership of sorts, each contributing to the ranch's operation in complementary ways. Grace had proven herself not just in the domestic sphere, but in understanding the business of ranching as well. Her talent for figures had revealed inefficiencies in Wade's operation, and her suggestions had already improved their prospects for the coming year. Yet despite this growing closeness, Wade maintained a careful distance in certain regards. He had not repeated his suggestion that they might revisit the original arrangement. He had not spoken directly of feelings or a future beyond the changing seasons. The walls around his heart had thinned but not fallen entirely. The catalyst for change came on a sweltering afternoon in late July. Wade and Elijah had ridden out at dawn to move a portion of the herd to fresh pasture, expecting to return by midday. Instead, they encountered a section of fence down, and cattle scattered across a neighbor's land, requiring hours of additional work to gather the animals and repair the boundary. By the time they turned toward home, the sun was low in the western sky, and both men were exhausted, thirsty, and short-tempered. "Miss Grace will be worried," Elijah observed as they crested the final rise overlooking the ranch. Wade didn't respond, but the same thought had been gnawing at him for the past hour. They had never been this late returning without sending word. The knowledge that someone would be concerned by his absence was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder of the connection he had allowed to form despite his initial intentions. As the ranch came into view, Wade tensed in the saddle. A horse he didn't recognize was tied at the hitching post, and a man stood on the porch, engaged in what appeared to be intense conversation with Grace. Even from a distance, Wade could see the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she kept the porch railing between herself and the visitor. "Trouble," he muttered, spurring his horse to a faster pace. As they approached, the stranger turned, revealing a well-dressed man of perhaps 40, with a trimmed beard and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Grace's face was pale, her expression a mixture of shock and fear that Wade had never seen there before. "Mr. Blackburn," she called, her voice tight, "this is Mr. Howard Pierce, my stepfather." Wade dismounted smoothly, handing the reins to Elijah with a meaningful look that the old ranch hand understood immediately. If there was trouble, Elijah would be nearby. "Mr. Pierce," Wade acknowledged, climbing the porch steps, "you're a long way from Boston." "Indeed I am, Mr. Blackburn," the man replied, his accent cultured but his tone cold. "A journey I would not have undertaken, had my stepdaughter not absconded with family property." "I took nothing that wasn't mine," Grace said, her chin lifting in defiance though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "The law would disagree," Pierce countered. "Your mother's jewelry was left to me, not to you. The money from its sale rightfully belongs to her estate, which I control." Wade moved to stand beside Grace, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "How did you find her?" he asked, keeping his voice level despite the anger building within him. "Bride services keep records," Pierce said dismissively. "It wasn't difficult once I discovered her method of escape. I've come to reclaim what is mine and to bring Grace home where she belongs." "I am home," Grace said firmly, "and I will not return with you." Pierce's face hardened. "You have no choice. You are using stolen money to live here under false pretenses. Unless Mr. Blackburn wishes to become an accessory to your theft, he will see the wisdom in cooperating." Wade felt Grace stiffen beside him, and in that moment, every instinct to protect what was his flared to life. Because she was his not as property, but as the person who had brought light and purpose back into his life. "Miss Thompson is under my protection," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Whatever dispute you have with her can be resolved without her leaving Montana." "Protection," Pierce's laugh was ugly. "Is that what they call it out here? She came as your mail-order bride, did she not? What exactly is your arrangement with my stepdaughter, Mr. Blackburn?" Before Wade could respond, Grace stepped forward, placing herself between the two men. "Our arrangement is none of your concern," she said. "The jewelry was my mother's gift to me before she died. I have witnesses who will testify to that fact." "Witnesses who conveniently remain in Boston," Pierce sneered, "while you hide in this wilderness with your protector." The implication was clear, and Wade saw the flush of shame and anger that spread across Grace's face. In that moment, he understood exactly what kind of man Howard Pierce was, and why Grace had fled across a continent to escape him. "Mr. Pierce," Wade said, his voice deceptively calm, "it's getting late, and you have a long ride back to town. I suggest you make it before dark." "Not without what I came for," Pierce insisted. "Either the money or the girl." "Preferably both." Wade's hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip, but Grace's fingers closed around his wrist, stopping him. "Violence isn't the answer," she said quietly. "It never is." She turned to her stepfather, her voice steadier now. "I will give you the money I have left, which is less than half of what I took. The rest has been invested in this ranch, in building a new life. That is my final offer." Pierce's eyes narrowed as he calculated his options. "Plus interest," he demanded, "and a signed confession of your theft, to ensure you don't attempt to challenge the estate distribution in future." "The money only," Grace countered. "No confession, no admission of guilt." For a tense moment, Wade thought Pierce would refuse. Then the older man nodded curtly. "Very well, the money now, and I'll be on my way." Grace disappeared into the cabin, returning moments later with a small cloth bag that clinked with coins as she handed it over. Pierce counted the contents meticulously, then tucked the bag into his coat pocket. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes cold as he looked at Grace. "Your mother would be ashamed of what you've become, living in sin in this God-forsaken place." Wade stepped forward, all pretense of civility gone. "Get off my land," he said quietly, "and don't come back, ever." Something in his tone must have conveyed the depth of his resolve, for Pierce backed down, descending the porch steps and mounting his horse without further comment. They watched in silence as he rode away, the dust from his horse's hooves hanging in the still summer air. When he was out of sight, Grace's composure crumbled. Her shoulders sagged, and she gripped the porch railing as if to steady herself. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you everything from the beginning." Wade guided her gently to the bench along the cabin wall, sitting beside her. "Tell me now," he said. As the last light faded from the sky, Grace revealed the full truth of her departure from Boston. The jewelry had indeed been her mother's, given to Grace with her dying breath. But the will Pierce had produced after the funeral had claimed all of her mother's possessions, leaving Grace with nothing but the promise of a roof over her head in exchange for what amounted to domestic servitude. "He made it clear what my role would be," she said, her voice hollow. "Housekeeper, nurse in his declining years, and she faltered. You don't need to say it, Wade said, his jaw tight with anger. I couldn't stay, she continued after a moment. The jewelry was rightfully mine. I sold it, used part of the money for passage west, and hoped to use the rest to establish myself somewhere he couldn't find me. And now, Wade asked, acutely aware that her plans had been derailed twice, first by his cousin's well-meaning interference, and now by Pierce's appearance. Grace looked out at the darkened ranch, at the garden she had planted, at the home they had begun to build together. Now I have nothing, she said softly. The money is gone, I'm not your bride, and I've been living here under false pretenses. I understand if you want me to leave. Leave? Wade turned to face her fully. Grace, do you think I care about the money? It's not just the money, she said. You heard what he called me, what he implied about us. Your reputation. Hang my reputation, Wade interrupted, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. The only thing that matters is what we know to be true. And what is that truth, Wade? She asked, her eyes searching his face in the gathering darkness. The question hung between them, demanding an answer he had been avoiding for months. Wade took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that matched his own, evidence of their shared labor, their shared life. The truth is that you belong here, he said, the words coming easier than he had expected. With me, not as my housekeeper or even as the bride my cousin ordered, but as my partner in every sense. If you'll have me. Grace's breath caught, and in the faint light from the cabin window, Wade could see tears gathering in her eyes. Are you certain, she whispered, after everything that's happened today? I've never been more certain of anything, he replied, and realized it was true. The walls he had built around his heart hadn't kept pain out, they had only prevented joy from entering. I love you, Grace Thompson. I think I have since the day you arrived and refused to be sent back east. A smile broke through her tears. I've been waiting months to hear you say that, she admitted. I was beginning to think you never would. I'm a slow learner, Wade said with a rueful smile, but I get there eventually. Grace leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. I love you too, Wade Blackburn, enough to leave if that's what's best for you. What's best for me is you, he said simply, here, building something together that will last. When their lips finally met, it felt like the natural conclusion to a story that had been writing itself since the day she stepped down from the stagecoach. Not the story Wade had planned, not the bride he had ordered, but something infinitely more precious because it had been found rather than sought. The wedding took place in September, when the aspen leaves had turned to gold and the first hint of autumn crispness touched the air. The small church in Willow Creek overflowed with ranchers, townspeople, and even travelers passing through who had heard the story of the mail-order bride who wasn't and the rancher who found love despite himself. Grace wore a dress of deep blue rather than traditional white, with wildflowers in her hair and her mother's locket, the one piece of jewelry she had kept, around her neck. Wade, clean-shaven and uncomfortable in his best suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him on Elijah's arm, the old ranch hand having proudly accepted the role of giving her away. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to face the frontier's challenges together, to build a life based on partnership and respect, to never let the walls between them rise again. As winter settled over the valley months later, bringing snow and long evenings by the fire, Wade often reflected on how differently his life had turned out from what he had planned. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with conversation and occasional laughter. The ranch that had been merely a place to work became truly a home. What are you thinking about? Grace asked one evening, looking up from the ledger where she was recording the year's profits, significantly improved under her management. Wade smiled, watching the firelight play across her features. About how the best things in life are the ones we don't plan for, he answered, the ones that find us when we're not looking. Grace set aside her pencil and moved to join him on the sofa, fitting perfectly against his side, as she had from the first time he'd held her. Like a bride you didn't order, she teased, her eyes bright with happiness. Exactly like that, he agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead, the very best surprise the West could offer. Outside, snow continued to fall on the ranch they now shared, covering the land in pristine white that would, come spring, give way to new growth, new life, new possibilities. Just as Wade's carefully constructed solitude had given way to a love he hadn't known he was searching for until Grace Thompson, now Grace Blackburn, had arrived to claim it.